Okay, then welcome to the colloquium today, and therefore to a lecture from Professor Ahmed from the Department of Religious Studies at the University in California, Santa Barbara, at the topic from the punishment to restitution. In the last few weeks, we had or have had the pleasure to have you as a participant. And today, for as a speaker, and we are pleased to that you give a lecture to us today, and so I will hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much. It is entirely fitting that my last presentation at the end of a very productive period where I stayed here in Erlangen, affiliated with Friedrich Alexander University. It's entirely fitting that that would be a presentation to this colloquium. I was very happy to be embraced immediately by all of you, and I listened to 4 of you in the last few weeks. So this is the time to get your feedback to my research, which has been going on for a long time. This Google Doc, now the Google documents are becoming my favorite way of sharing information because I can keep editing, but also I can give it to as many people as I want. So I understand Teresa made it available already to some of you. I mean, all she'll do is just share it like this, and yeah, I can see some of you here. And if you haven't yet been made to see it, you can ask me and I can do that. All I do is just add your email and you can see everything. If I make you an editor, that means you can actually give me feedback right inside the document. If you're a viewer, you just see what is there. And so today, the title is From Punishment to Restitution. This has been the title for many presentations that I gave before. One was, the first iteration was actually for a series of 4 articles on the Harvard Islamic Law blog, and I reference it at the end of the file. And then there was one in the Political Theory Colloquium at the University of California in Santa Cruz that was done one day after the 2020 presidential elections. I also referenced that here, and I have a version of that if you're interested. Now in this iteration, I would like to focus on the basics, and that's what I will do with you. Number one, what is the argument? The argument is that the economy of prisons and the way prisons are seen as a solution to crime are a scandal of the modern mind. Prisons really showed the limits of the human imagination and showed its inability to think productively about punishment, which makes me question even the notion of punishment. And of course, that requires an alternative, and I'll talk about the alternative and the inspiration for it. But imagine a world where we, instead of thinking immediately about punishment, we think about compensation, restitution, fixing the situation, thinking about how things were before a crime or even before a tort. Right? Everybody might need a reminder of the difference. A criminal act like theft, for example, when I go and steal something from your home, that's considered a crime, even though it is attached to property. I didn't hurt you at all, except that I appropriated your property. Now, it would be a tort if the negligence was not considerable, and I'm driving, for example, fast, and I just hit the side, let's say, of your car. And, usually insurance takes care of that kind of thing. There's another kind of breach, which is called breach of contractual obligation. If you and I make a deal, for example, let's say I'm one of these thieves who proliferated in the United States after COVID-19, everybody became an expert on getting masks and they would get millions of them. And it turns out many of them didn't know how to get them. So if somebody made an agreement and failed to deliver, there would be liability based on the breach of the contractual obligation. So these 3 categories, you violated your contract, or you committed a civil wrong that leads to a tortious liability, or the criminal all of these are encompassed in a kind of legal literature that I'll refer to at the end. That's called Majma' al-Damanat, Encyclopedias of Liability. But before we get there, let me go through some elements here to show you also where I situate myself in the middle of it, maybe a larger discussion. You will see it's a little heavy, of course, on the US side, but it also has a European side that is growing now. This man, you will not necessarily have heard of him. Chesa Boudin was the district attorney for New York. Excellent lawyer, an amazing kid. I mean, I say kid just because he's about 9 years younger than me, but he's a very good intellect, and knew exactly the problem. We have prisons are not solving any problem. They in fact harden people for the most part. There are enough studies of that, and there are studies even about how this was always the case. Jorn reminded me of a study, I'll talk about it in a little bit, in England between 1840 and 1900, in Ireland and in England. Either people went to jail already sort of insane and ready for an insane asylum on reception, or in some cases, if they were not crazy, they were made crazy by living in jail. Jails produce exactly the opposite effect. They're not correctional facilities, they are a problem. Anyway, so Chesa said, we will never treat mental illness with solitary confinement anymore. People didn't like it. He stayed a district attorney for New York only a couple of years, and he was removed. We have this peculiar institution in California where you can recall officials. So the governor, for example, Gavin Newsom, was recalled at some point, which means vote again, even though the guy's term didn't end. So we will go to the polls and say, yeah, we voted for this guy, but now let's see how many of us still agree. Gavin Newsom survived his recall. This guy didn't. He was removed. The recall was in June 7th, and of course it took about a month for the mayor of San Francisco to appoint a successor. He's out of a job now. Why? Because he believes what I believe. So, okay, so I am in the company of losers to an extent, because people are afraid of crime. So if I ever suggest that punishment can be removed or modified, or we have to think about compensation instead of punishment, you know, this is the kind of reaction that I get. Do I have other allies? Richard Posner was an appellate judge in Chicago, a major jurist, very conservative. So if Chesa was a liberal and he thought what he thought based on faith in human rights and feeling very bad for what happens in prisons, Richard Posner is different because he was a leader of what we called the law and economics movement in the 80s and 90s. They were very loud, saying that what we should think of, legal institutions are all essentially about the protection of economic value. Anything that includes crime and criminal law too. So he's famous for this text, Economic Analysis of the Law. But then when he was asked, well, how do you deal with crime? So for example, if you destroy my pen or my book, you know, if you lose a book to the library, you compensate by either buying the book or paying twice the price so that we can also accommodate for the services that are spent on making sure that the books are returned or and also replaced. But it's money for money. But what happens with a human life? What is the price of a human life? And his theory, he came up with this famous article back in 1985 saying, it's still the market also. How do I compensate for that? Let's say, you know, Peter Hartung and I are competitors in the market. If I were to eliminate him from the market, make it impossible for him, for example, to bid against me, that would give me certain advantages. If I did that illegally, I would be punished by having to compensate him for all the economic losses. Now, killing him is essentially the same. So if I kill Peter, I eliminated a competitor in the market. I also eliminated a source of income for his family. So a law and economics analysis of crime will have to attend to all these things. It's not easy. I mean, he knows that. He knew that that would be very hard. And we know that that's hard. Of course, anybody who did medieval Islamic jurisprudence knows that that thought is exactly what Muslim jurists had, developing the tribal idea of the diya. And then they put a price on human beings. And of course, it turns out that the price of a man is twice the price of a woman. Why? Because she doesn't work, or not usually. She doesn't support her family. And then also, children are different, and then applying that to fetuses, and and of course they also extended it in very strange ways when they applied it to non-Muslims. But we know that system. Okay, is there a price for a human being? Well, the Richard Posner's thought is still different from what we thought, what Muslim jurists thought in the past, but it overlaps a little bit. In modern time too, Arzu Osanlo, this is another professor of law here. She teaches at the Washington Law School, University of Washington in Washington State, not Washington, D.C. And she's of Iranian stock. And this book came out of Princeton, also kind of created a small revolution, because she was showing how the Iranian government today, by administering the diya situation, now, by the way, the Iranians now equate the diya of a man or a woman, because they say, well, now they have the same capacity in terms of earning. But Arzu also showed that the government, all the government does to make sure that you forgive. When someone kills, for example, my father deliberately, I have the right to say, no, execute him or her, and I could also forgive and then seek that compensation. So what Arzu showed was sometimes the crimes are in the family. There's one case here that's very touching. You would be crying. I told Mashed, I give her a copy of the book, that you would be just sitting there crying all the time. Why? It's a woman and her two daughters. They killed the husband of the woman and the father of the two daughters. And they cut him into pieces, and it's very miserable kind of crime. And who has the right to either forgive or not forgive? Of course, is the sister of the deceased, that is the aunt of the girls. And what is shown here in the book is how the judge was making sure that, yeah, you have to forgive. These are your nieces. Yes, you hate your sister-in-law. And of course, the matter was, they claimed that he was sexually abusing both his wife and his daughters. So the judge was interested in making sure that the story of the aunt goes to the press, and said, if you tell them, that was not true, that they will take what you say. And she was somehow willing to forgive. And so this book shows also that this idea of the price even for the human being, which is the hardest one, can work. What it shows is that it's not only rich people who can deal with crime. So, okay, if I kill someone and I'm really rich and it's only $5 million, for example, but I have the money and I can pay it, then it's easy for me to keep killing because I have the money. But what happens if I was a taxi driver and I just drove very fast and I killed someone? And now we have the diya. There's a lower level of diya for the mistaken kind of killing or inadvertent killing, but it's still a lot. Could be, let's say, another $1 million or $2 million. How would the taxi driver pay? What this book shows is that what they do is, of course, it used to be, there was something called the aqila. Male relatives would get together and collect the money. There's nothing like that. Now it's usually your employer who takes care of these things. So the taxi driver will work free for his company for the next 20 or 25 years, but he comes back to his family. I mean, maybe his family will not want to be his family, but if they accept him and he's still the main support for the family, they'll keep going. So there are all kinds of surprising things that are very modern that work out. Anyway, so that's why I thought I wanted to mention ours. I also wanted quickly to mention that book again that Jörn reminded me of. I just actually skimmed it and read the first and second chapter and the fourth chapter. This is a book about how prisons were always a problem like this. This book actually is so hard to read also. It's very sad because it's the connection between mental breakdown and prisons. In England, of course, they have these weird institutions. If you heard of something called the poorhouse, people can't work at all. The government takes care of them, but the conditions have to be awful so that nobody wants to be in a poorhouse. And a special case of that, something called a workhouse, where able-bodied people were required to work just for the lodging and the food. And, if you know anything about Charles Dickens, he went and visited these places and kept crying and, wrote all kinds of novels, famous stories about how it's just, you can't do that kind of thing to human beings. Now, criminals were a special case within that, of course, because they're jails. And then what I learned from this book also, I didn't know that the word jail would indicate the large institution that belongs to the whole state. and prison was the local. In England, in the United States, it's the opposite, by the way. If I say prison, that is a state, federal, either a federal institution, right? These are federal prisons, or they belong to the government. And then jail is for the local, but they have it reversed. And of course, also in this book, you find funny things like the word jail spelled G-A-O-L. Nobody can think that way, of course. In the United States, it's J-I-L. But anyway, it's an interesting book. Of course, you can find here all kinds of images, solitary and confinement. You see sometimes idealized images. See how the girls, of course, you know, if you're in solitary confinement, you're just kind of half crazy. Like eventually you get driven to that. And these numbers that, as I said, that you would find that once people go to jail, there will be a report, for example, saying that the people were already crazy before entering, and those who were not will definitely be driven crazy. Well, is Europe different? I mean, of course, I've gotten a lot of flack since the last few weeks, because whenever I talk about the US, oh yeah, the US, we know the problem. The problem, of course, in the US is complicated, as I put in my paper, by the fact that many of the people in jail are Black. And it was really, there is a movement, a kind of an idea, and Angela Davis is a very explicit advocate for this idea that all we have is just, we moved from slavery to incarceration. Right? All we did, the 13th Amendment said, we're freeing Blacks, yes, unless they're in jail. So you can never force anybody to work free unless they're in jail, and then we put them in jail. They're essentially 3 times their percentage of the population inside the jails. So it's an embarrassment. It's a particular embarrassment for the human mind and the human world. But then, you know, let's also be honest. Here is a report about European prisons. It doesn't include Germany, but, you know, it could have. And we have Italy, France, Greece, Latvia, Poland, Portugal, Spain, and the United Kingdoms. And at least one thing is common. Yes, maybe they don't beat people all the time, but sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, and humiliation, these are constant. This is just part of what jail is. We don't want to think about it. So what is the solution? I mean, well, of course, there's no neat solution. But about 3 or 4 years ago, I was in Istanbul and I was tampering with some of these manuscripts in the Sulaymaniya, and I found this literature, Majama al-Damanat. It looks like this. You would have, this is one version. This is a guy named Ghanib Muhammad Baghdadi, died around 1601. And he has, see, 38 categories, 38 kind of sections, chapters, and each one of them has sub-chapters. He looks at compensation on every level. Think of a pawn contract. Think of theft or usurpation. Think of destruction of the property of others. Think of a destruction of a human life. Think of a deposit, a partnership. In any of them, you'll find some funny cases there. So, for example, something called ضمان غاصب الغاصب. How does that strike you? A thief who stole from a thief. Some interesting cases here. Because what happens if the judge who looks at the second theft, so person B stole from A, does the judge just decide the case? So B is liable to A, and then he doesn't have to go further because he doesn't know. He might not know that A is not really an owner, is not a rightful owner. But what if he knows? Is he required to push the property all the way to the rightful owner or not? What happens if the thief number A, the first thief, had a relationship with the rightful owner and he claimed that he was owed a debt, and the reason he stole was actually to compensate for the debt? They thought about every kind of situation, and tons of manuscripts I've seen. This is another one by a guy named Zimbilizad, also around the same time. So the 16th century has multiple ones of this kind of thing. So, well, let me add a couple of layers, and that's all in my document. The first question I have is, are we really positivists? When we say that we're positivists and we're skeptical of mixing law and morality, why do we punish people very harshly? There is no moral justification for that punishment. What is it? Some kind of administrative thing? And if we're really pragmatic, aren't we interested in just fixing the situation? what prisons don't fix the situation. As I said, they harden the population. Sometimes people are not really criminal, but they become criminal inside jail. So what if I think about compensation, fixing the situation, correcting the situation, compensating the victim? Wouldn't that change? Wouldn't that go better with positivism? I have that question, and I asked it many times, and I know people have answers, but I say here, and I don't mean to say this arrogantly at all, but I want a good, not any answer. A lot of people say, yeah, well, look, you know, positivists also have to live. It's not a suicide pact. We'll ultimately want to live. Don't you want to save your property? Yes, but the punishment has to look like what we think. And of course, I'm not saying that religious regimes are the solution. Religious regimes were awful, but we made it worse. Because it used to be like you get a flogging, 100 flogs, and you go home. And now you're going to sit 5 years, get 100 floggings every day or every other week or something like that. And is it a social science question? One of my presentations was again in Santa Cruz, UC Santa Cruz, and I got one of these very smart rising scholars, a guy named Mark Masoud. And he said, look, I need numbers. You're going to have to show me that your method is going to either reduce crime more or make it somehow better for the society, the coherence of the society. Just, I need numbers. This is a social science question. But then, of course, politely, he said, and you know, you're not a social scientist, so you're not going to do it. So this is just going to remain essentially an academic's intuition, and it's not really a scientific thing. Well, it is. This is just an intuition because, you know, I think of myself as a legal epistemologist, as a legal philosopher, historian. I'm not even the kind of historian who's interested in, you know, necromancy or reviving the dead and making them come to the room. That's not my thing. I'm thinking about the present and the future, but I get ideas from the past because I find that to be very inspiring always. So because the inspiration comes from these majama al-Damanat, I would like to leave it just open because I'm not advocating for any of the specific compensations that were suggested in the 16th century. And that would be crazy because I know these people were okay, sometimes even inflicting punishments aside from the Damanat or the compensations that would not be appropriate, would not be different from the jails. Although, just to be also clear with you, there are people who started to look at jails. There was one person who went to, I think he went to Princeton undergrad, then worked for the police a little bit, and then hated being in the police. So went to Harvard, did a PhD. He teaches now in the John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York. And he wrote a book called In Defense of Flogging. He went too far. He was just saying, look, you know, if we give people the option, either flogging or jail. He did that in Australia. There was something called the Festival of Dangerous Ideas. And he asked people, if you are a criminal and you have to either go to jail for years or get a flogging and go home, maybe you'll be sick for a little bit. I think 2/3 agreed to the flogging. So he goes much farther than to me, I think of it as an economic question. There's a lot of money that goes into jails. It's the second cost pretty much after war. So for the US budget. So it's one scandal that the US spends that much money on war. And we want to, of course, encourage everybody to do the same thing now because of the invasion of Ukraine. So we want to have multiple jails, multiple kind of armies or militaries to resist militaries like the Russian one. But also there are these militaries inside. And on top of it, of course, we have the Second Amendment, which allows people to own guns. And so, well, this is my spiel. I hope I got it and got to you and explain my ideas. I'm willing now to be flogged in a more metaphorical sense with your questions and inquiries. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for your interesting lecture. Yeah, now it's time for questions, for some comments.
So I have Serdar. Oh no, Serdar was just that was just an approval, but no question. Anybody with a question or even ruminations? If you have incomplete ideas, that's fine. I'll brainstorm with you.
Jan.
Thanks a lot. I mean, we already started a bit the discussion earlier when meeting. I mean, the political and social dimension for me are obviously clear. I mean, the need for proper reform in this, you know, the punishment system, and the differentiation between, you know, who is revenging what and why. I would like to learn a bit more the Islamic legal aspect of your inspirations and the limits of transferability or the conditions for, you know, being able to transfer the instrument, what kind of instruments in different legal framings or different legal systems. What do you see as linkages between, for example, the continental European way of dealing with legal cases in the penal field and the American one, which is, you know, with a grand jury and you know, and then they give a verdict and the judge is then deciding about, you know, concrete details. How do you see this relationship between, you know, forms of possible instruments of compensation and the linkages to particular ways of granting justice in, you know, in particular informed systems?
Very good. This is definitely the next step in the discussion. So first, how useful are these old paradigms? Not always very useful when you get to the details, but I'll try to explain it. There is something in Hanafi law in particular, and in these encyclopedias, the deference to urf, that gets more and more over the centuries. So by the time you get to these majama', you already established ways of almost, you know, it's okay even not to compensate sometimes. So how some of these people begin, they begin, for example, with the question of coercion. Coercion is a very normal thing in society. It happens inside the home. Sometimes the household is really led by a guy who is harsh on his kids and his wife. And that changes how we look at their behavior. So they will not be liable for some of their mistakes. In the state, we have the sultan, and sultan could also be too coercive. And they're well, I could say they're a little confused because they have a doctrine from the beginning of Hanafi law that once a contract is created, you cannot say it was done under coercion, okay? So if I go to a judge and say, well, my wife established that I divorced her with witnesses, and I'm saying, no, I was really forced. Her brother came and put a knife into my face. The judge usually dismisses this because contracts are contracts. Okay, if a process is completed, and that applies to sales and stuff like that. So on the one hand, they don't want to negate this old principle, which goes back all the way to Muhammad Hassan Shaybani, but they struggle with it because, of course, if coercion should affect anything, it should affect contracts too, because people get coerced to make deals that they don't mean. And in fact, in the modern state, we have more and more of that. You know, you immediately agree to something. Every moment you move from one website to another, you're selling your information or giving them free just by a click, unless you're very savvy and you're aware. So occasionally in a modern court, we have to also take that into account, that sometimes either coercion or the speed with which people make commitments has to have us. That's on one issue. So I told you now a couple of things that I would be very careful about. Number one is they're deferring to urf. They really sometimes have very bad habits just because they're common. It's common in Istanbul, for example. It's common in Konya for people to do that. Sometimes the tailors would say things like, oh, okay, I'll take this free, or I'll take this for half price. And they just look at how people deal with similar situations. What would the majority of people in the town, and usually the judge is from the town. So in a modern state, in a modern city even, we don't have that space, right? You have to sometimes decide these things in legislation. But you could actually come up with a very good regime, and eventually, I'm not going to use the awful word social engineering, but you will accustom people to accepting or expecting certain principles. The point is that people will stop litigating, right? We want people to be comfortable, and once they come out of court, if it is a tort case in particular, if it is a civil case, then they're just happy and satisfied. When it comes to crimes, of course, it will be harder because there are emotions. But then still the same principle applies. Take the old ideas and modify them sufficiently. You also demanded something very useful from me. Take Europe and take the United States. Now we have the jury system. As you know, I mean, that even originated in England and with the common law, but England now got rid of juries in civil cases because there is a recognition that people can be a problem for the judge. I mean, I have been, of course, I was called to jury service 3 times, and it's a miserable thing that because people don't necessarily have the intelligence or the commitment to the case. And sometimes emotions play a role. Sometimes it works both ways, right? So the defense lawyer, for example, can get someone like O.J. Simpson out of a crime that he most likely committed. He probably even basically confessed to that after he got out. And at the same time, they can take a poor guy with bad lawyering, with a bad lawyer, and put them in jail forever. The one thing that you reminded me too, you have the prosecutor in the United States, which is a very strange thing. They can suggest sentencing. So not only the prosecutor is supposed to be an adversary to the defendant, right? And the judge is a neutral one. So let's say I'm the prosecutor. I think the criminal committed the crime. I should establish that case and stop and leave it to the judge or the jury to do the sentencing. But sometimes the prosecutor has the right to make suggestions to say, if you can establish this crime, that person deserves 15 years. It's a very strange thing. It doesn't happen in Europe. And there are a lot of studies that make comparisons based on to show how the long sentences usually come from the fact that the judge goes lazy. The judge gets lazy in the United States, and they just follow the guidelines that the prosecutor provides. The prosecutor is an adversary. So if he establishes that someone most likely committed the crime, it's another question how we punish, of course, within the legislative limits. So, okay, it's a mess, therefore, Joran. What you need is to build something. I would agree with the Hanafis on one thing. Culture is important. Urf is important. The custom is important. What works in California is not going to work in New York. And what works actually in Southern California most likely won't work in the North. So in Southern California, or in the Central Coast, as we call it, where I live in Santa Barbara, it's a small communities, a lot of rich people and very few poor people. And crime has a certain quality to it. I actually think it's a great laboratory for compensation. We could reduce jails very easily. Los Angeles, same thing. Los Angeles is just a big version of the same thing. And if it weren't for the homeless and the poverty that's rampant, you could deal with this kind of thing. So what you have, okay, the inspiration that you get from Hanafi jurists is that they're open to the idea of compensation in principle. We can think creatively about this. Think of the model of the book, the lost book. That to me is the starting point, not the market. Because when I lose the library's book, I know it's expensive. It could be $100. And when the library imposes $200, not $100, it says twice the price, or sometimes 3 times the price. I am okay paying, not just because I'm rich, but also because I know that then I will not be able to have any books if all the books are lost like that, right? So I'm also a beneficiary of the system. And that is the difficulty. I have a bee here that's trying to come and give me a kiss. That's not going to be a very happy kiss. If you've been kissed by a bee before. So if people are participants, this is the model. If people are participants, they will think also of how the compensation system works for them later on. I agree that it will have to be for a modern society. It's a society of strangers. I don't know if we ever can figure out how insurance can be case by case. It have to be a no-fault insurance, and there will always have to be a bunch of money that we use to compensate when people are too poor to compensate. But you got the point, you got the idea. I am thinking in a very abstract level. I was just happy to see that these guys who lived 400 years ago had that thought, that you could, in principle, compensate instead of punish. Well, this bee is insisting on getting to me. So, okay, back to what happened here? Yeah, okay. Dominic, I think, has a question. Are you satisfied, Jordan? Should I move to Dominic, or I should actually let Teresa lead the organization?
Yeah, it's okay, Dominic.
Yeah, thank you so much for this inspiring talk. Actually, I completely agree with you on the skepticism about prisons and then also about punishment. And I think that this idea with the compensation is really a very good idea, and it's worth to think about it. My concern is more that also with the compensation, you also just like kind of still punish the criminal or the perpetrator. And I somehow stick to the idea of Durkheim that the prisons are the mirror of the society, and you know, like that like even with a compensation, the underlying reasons why a criminal was conducting this crime, which is maybe more a social problem, kind of, you are still not tackling with compensation. You know, some people just end up in prison because society somehow didn't give them another choice, or at least like from a Durkheimian perspective, maybe. And I also think like you still have this problem that Foucault like draws our attention to, that prisons are just like intend to remove human misery and suffering of the convicted from the public view. So this is still somehow, you know, even with the compensation, this dimension is still the same somehow, right? Or
so you mean when I keep the people, so I'm keeping the people in society. Yeah. You could use technologies, for example, you know, the ankle surveillance, monitor surveillance. You can put something in somebody's feet. Now they do that in probation when someone just finished their sentence and they don't want them to go home without being staying under surveillance. I know it's a very humiliating thing. And it sometimes doesn't work because you could strike very fast. So let's say I'm the criminal and I got out, having paid all the compensation, made commitments, and my life is going to change for the rest of my life. But you know, for the rest of it, it will be different. Even my relationship with my kids will be different. But everybody knows I'm a criminal too. So that changes my behavior. If it is a really small crime, let's say I stole some pizza just to eat. There are ways, I think, to make it clear that this person is not a murderer. This person just stole to eat, like, you know, Jean Valjean, right, in the Les Miserables. The problem is, you know, we need to know that that person just stole bread, and that in fact his sentence got extended just because he tried to escape. So it's a wrong on top of a wrong. Okay, so if you are in society and under surveillance, there is danger, and of course, repeat offenders have to be treated with a measure of harshness that makes this repetition hard to think of. Right, so to an extent, I mean, Durkheim, of course, Durkheim's argument is very hard to make today, because what we do is we create a very different society once we create the prison society. Of course, they came from our society. The prisoners came from the normal society, but then later they became something else. Right? Sometimes they become mentally insane, or they become just another weird society with weird morality too. They develop their own morality, sometimes like a mafia morality. They have loyalty to each other and they have enemies and so on. So it's not normal life. I think Durkheim may have been right 100 years ago or so. Now, Foucault, of course, is right, because what we do is we don't want to think about these people. We put them outside. In a way, we should. we deserve to think about them. Sometimes the reason the person stole my pizza is because he's too poor and I didn't pay enough taxes. And maybe now I'll begin to think differently. Maybe the mentally insane needed more attention. So I'll pour more money into this. So I know it's a big punishment, but think about it. When we give credit, when you write a book, Dominic, you have to write 4 or 5 pages saying you didn't write the book alone. Everybody helped you. Now, when you commit a crime, it's just your fault? No, also conditions forced you to do it somehow. I mean, I'm not going as far as the people who say, well, there are no criminals, we're all just conditions of our conduct, because there will have to be compensation for, if somebody breaks something, they have to be fixed. That thing has to be fixed. But it's still partly true that we're responsible for that. So yeah, let's suffer a little bit more, by seeing these people. I know that's the hardest part, because what happened in San Francisco was that the people I know, some of my friends would say, look, the crime is just rampant. I can't go out. I'm afraid. And somehow they're not afraid because of the Second Amendment, where somebody can shoot kids, but if you have it here in Erlangen, it's going to be weird, because you begin to see criminals and you see them kind of with their feet blinking because they have this surveillance monitor, and but maybe you'll get accustomed to it, or you'll begin to pour the resources there. Anyway, this is the thought. So I know it has many rough edges, and it's a scary thought.
Raise your hand, and after Mahmoud.
Yeah. One second. Thank you, Ahmed. You invited ruminations, right?
Yeah.
Because you made me ruminate a lot. Right. Thank you very much for this. Is tremendous food for thought. There are a couple of conceptual things that go through my mind. That is, and very basic conceptual things like what is a crime? Who defines what a crime is? Prosecution. What purpose is prosecution serving? What is the position of the jail in the whole conglomeration when a common excuse for persecution is to deter others from doing the same. Now, deterrence is not very well do if you put people away in jail, because you don't see them, right? A public execution, and it's probably not by accident that executions in the United States are publicly witnessed. So there is this.
There used to be a big spectacle, actually. If you read in the literature, it's embarrassing. Most people until the early 1900s, they loved to see people die. No, now, of course, they're witnessed, right? They're witnessed by victims, but they're not. I think there is a change in the mores. The people don't like seeing terrorist acts, but they used to love that kind of thing. So,
yeah. And I think the big difference nowadays is you don't have showed people doing some clownery things for public entertainment before it all climaxes into some intestines being taken out.
The carnivals, for example, the carnivals also used to have very gruesome things. People don't have a taste for that anymore.
And so now what I was thinking is, okay, where does it all come from? And a reading that was two readings interrelated to an extent were quite eye-opening for me. The German philosopher Dieter Thome, which been also translated into English as, I dug it out, Troublemakers, a philosophy of the poor robustus. And the other is Nancy Eisenberg's study on white trash. Chanting the narrative of equality, the narrative of Enlightenment philosophical anthropology as a hoax. There's no such a thing as equality. There's no such a thing as equality before the law. There's an ideal of equality before the law, but actually see is elites versus people who are not considered to be elites, who are economically depraved, with all the consequences that lead into that. So now I was thinking, okay, if that, and what Dieter Thome actually is getting at is saying this idea of natural law, the insight in the necessity to commit yourself to certain principles of social interactions, to make left all these Enlightenment philosophers all the way into the 20th centuries a little bit in a tricky space when to deal with those who don't fit that bill. Are they insane? And you see that you pick the same buttons. And the authors you refer to that push the same buttons. Are they insane? Are they intrinsically criminal? Yeah, the gypsies, they are prone to steal and to do all these things. You have to sort of deal with that merely because they're gypsies. So what is that when viewed to the actually quite, nice idea of everybody is equal before the law. If O.J. Simpson can afford an expensive lawyer or a team of expensive lawyers, that means his economic status is actually a major factor in facilitating the process in which something that someone else has previously defined as a crime, to take someone's life, in contrast to someone who doesn't and who will go away. So what I'm trying to think of is now when you bring in these Hanafi jurists, is that actually empirically sustainable as well? I mean, indication how the compensation worked and whether this compensation was actually justly applied, or whether someone who was of a higher social or economic status could actually get softer out than someone who was in a more precarious situation.
Very good. So to tie in some of these thoughts, first, I think because you expressed this thought about a month ago when Mahmoud was talking, you have this fundamental skepticism about crime itself, the notion of crime. And I think if you think about torts also, you will have a similar kind of skepticism that who gets compensated in a civil wrong case, usually someone who's very rich, because it's so whether it's an actual crime or a violation of property that doesn't ascend to that level. So, but that one of the thoughts I had also in the process of developing these ideas is why we distinguish crime from tort. I thought it was such a new idea. What if we connect the two? Because that's what I see in Majma' al-Damanat, that compensation is the main thing, even in a crime, but the model is built on the tort and the contractual liability, which means that we think of crime as the exception to the problems in human behavior. I thought it was such a new idea, and then I found it in Arzu Assemble. So Arzu actually has the same thought, and she came up with that term. She didn't even invent it. Somebody else came up with it. Crime tort, one word, CRIME-TORT. Thinking of the class of violations, whether it's negligent or malicious, whether it's property or the human body or dignity, as one thing. And we think then of compensation as the main paradigm. So I'm with you on your skepticism, but I can also be skeptical about why. I mean, of course, someone like Marx thought the law, the very idea of law, is there only to protect the rich. Once they stole from everybody, then now it's bad to steal because they already stole, they're done stealing. So laws will say that theft is bad. Well, how about the theft before the law that allowed all these people to use the laborers and not compensate them enough? So I understand this skepticism. I think I share it on a certain level, Peter, much more than actually anybody who studied law and different laws to the extent that I did, because most people, when they study law too, they realize that there's something wrong with human nature. In fact, you don't have to be religious to have this thought, that people violate rules all the time. Yeah. And I'm not that committed to rules, but there are certain rules that cannot be violated because otherwise the unpredictability of everyday life becomes such a burden on everybody. Anyway, so we agree. I share some of your skepticism. And you're right also to extend the issue, of course, to poor whites, because in the United States, it's not just blacks and it's not just Hispanics, it's not just Muslims. Poor whites, in fact, there are more poor whites in Santa Barbara, among my students, than poor Arabs. For the simple reason that the University of California in Santa Barbara now is a Class A institution, and a lot of the Arabs who would come either they have Gulf background or they're very rich, international students, or people who grew up rich in some Los Angeles communities or Santa Barbara community, while at the same time, the original whites of the Central Coast are poor people. There are people whose parents didn't go. Sometimes they have to go to the city college. We have something called the Santa Barbara City College. And when they do very well, then they go up to the California state schools or come to me if they're really, really good. The University of California has a research school in principle. So I'm totally sensitive to this, that poverty has no color. And it can, and that's why I was fascinated also by Victor Hugo, because he's talking about mostly, white people who are poor, who are also ostracized. And so I'm totally with you. Now, your final question, your final turn is, when I read these Majma' al-Damanat, do I really have the sense that it's going to work? And doesn't it also have the same distinction that will allow some rich people to get out? I think the answer to the second question is yes. It's the potential for corruption with Damanat is just as much because there is discretion. And that you could eliminate. You can begin to take away some of the discretion from the judge and say that, yes, when certain violations occur, you're not allowed to say, just walk out. This is the custom of especially when there is ambiguity too in the custom, in the urf. But is it, doesn't it fare better with a skeptic about crime? I think it does. So the idea of Daman should please me and you more because we go to bed more comfortable because we know we inflicted some damage, but not the kind of damage that if we were wrong to begin with, that we didn't appreciate how much pressure that person had to go through to become a criminal. So because we didn't inflict that maximum damage, we feel better about ourselves. We are scared, of course, for the society because we didn't punish enough. We didn't scare enough, which means that these people can come back and strike if they are actually malicious. So I think my idea, Arzu's ideas, these ideas work better with a skeptic who really is wondering why there is poverty to the extent that there is poverty, why the 8 billion people can't just get along, why do we keep hurting each other, and sometimes we don't understand each other. We have an argument and then all of a sudden there's a fight, and that's what leads to crimes against the bodies. It's usually ideas, just very strange thing. Sometimes it's theft, as we know. Yeah, sometimes theft leads to murder, and sometimes just negligence. People drink and drive, for example. And, when the road is very good and the cars are good, just all kinds of weird things can happen. Thank you, Peter. This is really the right stimulation for me, because I need to figure out all these theoretical questions before I go at 80 miles an hour.
Mahmoud?
To mute it again. Thanks again, Ahmed, because I think we have discussed this topic also before, but I have a small question, and I don't know if you really have an answer for it, because exactly what other clan leaders here in Germany are saying. Prison have no solution for our conflict and problems here in Germany. And we need to go to our customary law, not Islamic law, but customary law, where we found really solutions, even for the diya, and also that ended with murder or with really big conflicts within the community. And I'm wondering if you can sell your argument here in Germany, because German, they are very well known for their regulations and laws for almost everything. They counted the trees, and they have laws for almost everything. How you can and punishment system doesn't bring really solutions. And we need maybe to go back to the Islamic or even to these tribunal customary law. And I am wondering if you really have a look also on these customary law that were existed before even the Islam. They argue that our customary law, they are not Islamic per se, but more were existed before the Islam, and we are using them in order to find peaceful solution for our problems and conflict, not to punish the people.
That's very good. So of course, it's not that we're suggesting that these guys evade all responsibility. If your clan people have to end up losing all their property if they commit a crime, if they need to actually compensate, I think they're just saying that they will take care of it based on diya. If they actually begin to pay this stuff, they will think about it twice. It might actually work better than prisons, because money always hurts. Losing your property, if you keep saving for your children, then because you committed a small crime, you lose all that. It changes people's behavior. But I'm with you that there is something that's not sitting well with, especially with European communities, with all the danger that goes on, even just with the fact of the European Union, because you have a kind of movement now. Forget about immigration. If you had no Turks and no Arabs at all, no Arab Spring, you would still have a problem, because the population, the European population, is not homogeneous, and people speak different languages, and they have been, even if we didn't invoke the gypsies. But I want to say something too, and this is one benefit of studying legal history. In Germany, until almost the end of the 18th century, torture was used as a way to improve evidence. Okay, so if I'm a criminal, for example, I killed someone, we need 2 witnesses, but we have only 1. They would take me and apply thumb screws or leg screws, and this thing, the rack, I'd be hanging like this, and they apply fire to my chest and all that. Not because it's punishment, it's not punishment, it's because we don't have a confession. So they do that so that I can begin to confess, and the confession has to provide new information. So the presiding judge, the judge who's overseeing the torture, will ask me, okay, you say that you killed this guy, show us the weapon. Because they will not stop torturing me until I give them information that shows that I'm actually confessing, not just to get out of the punishment. And then they'll apply out of the torture, and then they'll apply the punishment. Then I can go to jail, or maybe something can happen. You see what I'm saying? So just 250 years ago, the Germans did things. Now, if they think about them, how did we do that? Really? And you show them, in the books and the images. No, we couldn't have done that. And I think it was Frederick, actually, was the one who stopped this kind of thing. It was later in Germany. It happened, I think, earlier in other parts of Europe. So things change, and I'm definitely not pushing in a direction that is harsher, but it has a cost. If you're not going to be very harsh, that means the society has to take part of the burden. So that's the hard question: is can the society accept that it is participating in the crimes that is affecting its life, partly by the disparity, by the being part of a community and not including other people, escaping, not really doing your part in acculturation, in the work of other people. See how conversations break down when people say, oh, you're just, George Tamer was telling me the other day, he came once and he was talking in a group and talking about Islam, and he said a couple of positive things. And then there was one person who was totally annoyed. What are you saying? You're saying Islam is good? That doesn't work for me. So occasionally people don't want to even think about the issue. I'm not, of course, saying that it has to do only with Muslim immigrants. As I said to Peter, I agree. It's more complex. Look, I could be a criminal tomorrow. Any one of us can be criminal. All it takes is being pushed over the edge. Mm-hmm. So I'm fairly comfortable financially. I don't need to steal or anything like that, but I could become a criminal. I could kill someone. Just put me in certain conditions. I could be scared, for example, for the life of my child, or you can make me feel that there's no hope, or that the law has been doing egregious things to me, and I will become a criminal. Everybody can become a criminal. The conditions create that. So it's just a hard thing, but it is part of being a human being and living socially, living civilly, living in a polis, living in a social arrangement, which is something that we've been trying to do for a long time and got into the political theory since Aristotle. We have to figure out a way to do it. But you're right, there is a cost, and it'd be harder in some places than others.
Maybe if I follow another question before you run, what do you think about this also ADR, alternative dispute resolution? Because there is in Europe and even in the US a long discussion about Muslim alternative dispute resolution, where also Sharia, some elements of Islamic law may be implemented. Do you see from your perspective, and even from what you reviewed in the Islamic legal perspective, and a chance maybe to establish such kind of alternative dispute resolution among the Muslim communities in the Western countries, Europe and USA, and maybe also Canada?
Excellent. Your questions, Mahmoud, are very distinct, because you notice what I say, how it invokes things I didn't think about. So the clan, the first question, the clan, of course, it's just a very hard puzzle, because these people don't seem to be interested in law at all. But you're right that what I propose sounds more like a support for what they're saying, which as I said, I want to make sure that nobody gets that from what I'm saying. The ADR thing, of course, is an issue that people have discussed for a long time. The United States, because of its size, has allowed this in principle. And if two people agree on something and they tell a judge, we agree, the judge is not going to even look at it, right? If you have an agreement with your wife, divorce with some kind of compensation and everything is clear, you go to the judge, they say, okay, in Massachusetts, for example, they say, we'll give you 120 days, but basically this is final, just to get into the record that these people who used to be married are not married anymore. And you can say things like that. You can say, for example, that the spouses are self-supporting, nobody expects anybody's money, the basic things that the hot buttons that the American court would be interested in. So you can resolve, in theory, you can resolve all your conflicts like that. It just doesn't happen that way, as we know. So once people make an agreement, they come back to court, they disagree. You have tons of cases. I was looking at nafaqa cases and divorce cases in Kansas. Sometimes the couple is Iranian and they have a certain system that the judge is not expecting. Sometimes the judge is prejudiced because they don't want to apply any aspect of Islamic law at all. But look, ADR, here's the problem with ADR. It's essential. If we have a liberal system, or a system that at least capitalist liberal system, kind of, in the United States, if you keep allowing these exceptions, eventually the system collapses, right? It depends on how many cases. So in New York, for example, there were jurisdictions where in places like Harlem and other places, well, the judges just had so much work and they didn't mind that some of these ADR deals were struck and they would just approve them. That's fine. But the problem is you find problems with it. And actually, Muhammad Fadl wrote about that. Yeah, there are a lot of people who notice that you can break any system by making exceptions, right? By the way, historically too, in Islamic law, the idea of awqaf was seen the same way, was similar to ADR. Because what is awqaf? When I'm too rich, I can put my property for public use. Could be a religious endowment. So here there's a hospital, there's a school and all that. But then after a few generations, a lot of the land is already been owned essentially or dedicated to the poor. And you lose usually the best land because usually rich people would have the best land. So my short answer is, yes, you could allow, I know Sharia tribunals also are on your mind. These started in England from the early 80s. And there are people who hate them. And there are people who think that they solve some of the problem because the judges also don't have the energy to deal with all these things and figure out the juristic disagreements. That these guys are Hanafis and these guys are Malikis. They don't want to deal with it. They just want something final. If you're not going to be polygamous, if you're not going to violate some basic constitutional right, then that's okay. And in the United States, it's the same thing. But I would support limiting these things. The modern state promises to take care of its citizens, right? So it cannot come back and say, it's too expensive to take care of everybody. No, I have to take care of everybody. I will allow local customs to dominate in certain aspects, yes, but they cannot be the main tool for judgment. As I said, one of the problems with especially this guy's Zada Fudil Jamali, he relies on urf so much that it's almost as if nobody wants the judge is gonna sleep and I don't know, sit and do whatever. And in modern times it'd be just surfing the internet. No, people have to work. The judge has to work, has to look for problems to solve. And if we can, is your sense that this is too hard for people, too hard for the government to take care of its population? You have to take care of your population. So you have to have the legislation. You have to have the tools to solve the problem. ADR needs to be limited. Alternative dispute resolution needs to be limited. I would allow it more in the family because also people have weird deals in the family, but also until a certain point, because sometimes there is abuse. There are parents who abuse their kids. And there are, of course, husbands who abuse their wives, and there are wives who abuse their husbands. It happens all the time. It's just you have to intervene from time to time to make sure the society is coherent. Okay, now I can hear Jorn. He's been waiting patiently.
Well, I would like to step into the same line and well, concerning if you are going to the cellars of the town hall of Nuremberg, the historic town hall of Nuremberg, they have cells and chambers of torture in the underground. And it was used till the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, Napoleon stopped it, or was stopped by, when the free imperial city of Nuremberg as a political body ended. And there were the Nuremberg people, well, at least the political totally happy about ending torture because they could observe and listen from their meeting hall. Anyway, concerning RDR, for example, like Mahmoud evoked in the context of clans or what have you. I mean, I'm totally with you, Ahmad. I think that this kind of exceptionalism is a problem for overall acceptance in the population, and overall acceptance, for certain forms of regulating conflict is of utmost importance. I mean, for social peace and for that people feel comfortable with the solution found and so on and so forth, and what would be immediately, a catastrophe, Muslim exceptionalism. The Muslims, they getting their own thing. And what with other people? I mean, you have the same with certain groups of southeastern Europe, minority groups like so-called gypsies. their own system of conflict resolution, and being already not only at the margin, but even perhaps of society, but even perhaps beyond. And I think that's a basic problem. And how to put it into the system of the state. I mean, are they then thresholds, or would it be that, you know, the rich people, or, you know, the elite creates their own conflict resolution system, and other groups as well, and then, you know, if in certain cases you get away, and in others not, because you are belonging to a different group? Or what happens if you belong to a group, and you know, your social group is saying, well, that's a case for us, but you don't want? I mean, we have it in the mediation, you know, field of embedded in the German legal system, where it is stated and stipulated that there must be consent, no coercion, you know, to accept mediation. That must be final approval by a judge, and so on and so forth. There's certain regulations on this kind of. In any case, that's very essential. But I have a different question again for you, Ahmed, concerning compensation, and if I got it right, that the compensation should be taken over by the state of cases. And here again, we have a big problem of acceptance. Imagine if you have a regular criminal saying, well, I mean, at the end, you know, I don't go to jail. I have no money to compensate, or only very little. The state or society will step in. All fine, and I do it again and again, because, well, I don't really feel the harshness or the burden of compensation, because, well, society is stepping in. And that creates problems, I would say, creates problem in regard to, I mean, the idea that this at the end, well, or for at least for certain cases, I mean, if you put somebody in a prison for a lifetime, or if you execute him, well, no way or no door open for, you know, moral improvement or something, you know, to become better. But I mean, the mistake, and I think that's for quite a lot of people, and you already addressed this problem, that people become criminal or you know, mentally ill in prison. The general idea that, you know, the prison is a place where you re-educate people, you know, to more socially acceptable. I mean, in most cases, I think that's a mistake. And did not happen, also because you are stigmatized by being in a prison. Perhaps with a few exceptions, you know, of economic criminals, of the very rich who end certain criminal activities in prison for a certain period of time. But I mean, it's very stigmatizing, and then, you know, re-entry into society is difficult. But what about these aspects? I mean, the effects when society is taking over compensation, and the question of, you know, for the criminal, you know, to behave different in the future. I mean, it's a very complex question, and it's not very easy to answer in the complexity of.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you're giving me an opportunity to clarify this, because I must have not stated it correctly. Nobody goes free in this system. If you're poor, you're healthy and able-bodied, you will work free. This is not, you know, when you read in the Islamic literature about the jizya thing, Umar ibn al-Khattab was so kind to some of these old Christians who could not work. The story goes, and he would say, oh, this guy worked for us when he was younger, now he just goes free and he doesn't have to pay. Or there are stories also about the Prophet when someone committed a crime, and then at the end there has to be a compensation. The compensation came from the treasury or Bayt al-Mal, and then he himself collected it because he was the poorest in the town. This doesn't work here. There's nothing like that in this. Everybody owes the labor and the money. So if I owe $1 million and I have zero, I don't just walk away and the treasury steps in. I have to work free for the next 20 years, 30 years. Even if I have a family before the crime, I need now to divide my labor to support my family, because that obligation is not going to go away. They will just be impoverished because I'm a criminal, right? They will have to be supported by me, but I will also have to pay for my crime. And I'll tell you why this is not very hard to understand. It's very realistic, because when people go to jail in the United States, they work in jail and they work free, and they produce sometimes some of the best shirts and some of the best stuff comes from the jails. And it is very cheap because they get compensated. I think the states, some states will pay them 3 cents an hour or something. You know, some of the regulations came because it's so unconstitutional to work free, but then they pay them very little. So if someone were to collect in normal, sometimes these people are very good workers, right? They're just prisoners. So instead of getting $25 an hour, they're getting 3 cents. So see how much the state is making money out of these people. So you can work in society instead of working in jail. All I'm saying is shift the paradigm, put the person who's working in jail, work outside. That taxi driver that Arzu Asanlo was talking about, the taxi driver killed someone inadvertently. He's still able-bodied. He's still in his early 30s or something like that. He's going to drive for the rest of his life, except that he's not going to make the money. So if his salary was going to be, say, the equivalent of $500 a month, and he has a family, so he has to cut from this, say, $100 to support his family, there are $400. He's not going to have ice cream. He's not going to ever have a good meal. He's going to have to pay for his crime by living impoverished for a long time. And of course, you have to work on this, because if you pressure people too much, they will strike again, right? There will be repeat offenders. So I need the help of psychologists, and I need the help of all experts to get to that point where people accept the defeat, right? When we put people in jail, we want them to accept their defeat. They're defeated completely. They can't escape. If they escape, we'll shoot them, all kinds of things. So there will be techniques to make sure that people accept this humiliation for a while. But this being outside still allows that person, at least in many cases, to come back, right? So I agree with you. There are cases we have to think about very, very long. There are people, maybe if they're subjected to medical examination, we cannot give them that opportunity. Maybe we'll put them on probation for a long time. But there are people who would just accept it, because there are poor people all the time. They live miserable lives, and they're not criminal. They're just unhappy. So that criminal can live miserably, but still be part of the society. And people work in jails. I just want them to work outside. But nobody walks free. There is no such a thing as Bayt al-Mal steps in because the guy is free and they keep committing the same crime. No. But thank you for giving me an opportunity to clarify this point. Yeah.
Only to aspect, I mean, then you have, again, there's a problem of social injustice, I would say, because, well, if you're rich, to simply get away. I mean, your fortune will diminish, of course, but I mean, that's all fine. And I can easily assume that, depending on the sort of crime, that people would say, well, paying for 20, 25 years, no. And living in misery, I would prefer, to go for 10 years in jail, perhaps work there, and then all is fine. The state social security system has to take care of my family or what else. I mean, and then, to have it more condensated, that they don't, I mean, it's not very attractive. And it's perhaps even less attractive than going for a certain period of time in jail. I mean, the people Mahmoud is working on, in Germany, in this criminal clan system, well, it's all priced in. It's all priced in. I mean, in the business plan, so to speak. I mean, if you have a certain subgroup, people active in criminal activities, Well, they know that, you know, here and there a luxury car will be confiscated now. They know that, you know, perhaps of 10 years in criminal business, they will spend 2 or 3 years in jail, or perhaps even 5. And then it's all fine, you know. They calculate it on the long run and considering, well, with my criminal activities on this or that amount of money, here and there I'm going to prison. But at the end, you know, I do a lot of things for which I will never be convicted, and then it's all fine. No, or people using, I mean, that you have also among the poor, people are committing, you know, minor crimes, but in some, that's quite often the case for the homeless, so that they can spend winter in a prison, being feeded and you know, having it warm, and then they go out, and that's part of their life. They are not criminal, you know, but you know that it's only kind of mean to arrange with their situation, and how to deal with this kind of situations in your, you know, overall thinking.
Well, so the last example, my system will deprive them of that advantage. Nobody's going to be able to.
Oh, so then they will have to freeze.
Well, so
being congelated, I mean, in California, no problem. But what if you're living
we
in
had a lot of
Chicago,
people
Illinois?
who died. A lot of people died in Los Angeles, homeless, who died because sometimes weather, sometimes COVID. I mean, this is another problem. You're dealing with the issue that the English solved with the so-called poor house, or poor houses, and the workhouses. So the people who never committed a crime, but they're really not participating in society. Sometimes these people smell so bad that nobody's going to give them an interview. They need some kind of regeneration or recreation of their personality. But before this last one, so this is a separate issue. But your initial question is still, it's still very interesting. How about the rich? Now, the rich, Jorn, have it different all the time, with and without crime. So the rich can spend $500 on a dinner, and the poor guy will be coming and they just want 5, and they're not going to give them the 5. And also there was something in Les Miserables, Victor Hugo has this weird image of a very beautiful woman, and she's just all made up, and the colors of her nails, and she's just so beautiful and very happy, and an expression of the luxury that was possible in the 1830s and 40s, I guess it was, the 1840s. And he said, I looked around, so that's her, and on the other side there was a really poor kid who's not looking at her. He said the problem will be once this poor person looks at that amount of luxury and that beauty, that you know, the girl's expectations of life are much higher than this person. This person just wants to take a shower, for example, or wants just to have a meal that doesn't have bugs on it or something. And on the other side, rich people have very high standards. So I buy my clothes from Costco's. You know what Costco's are? This is a big company that actually mostly sells food. I don't know the difference between good clothes and bad clothes, right? And then there are people, a friend of mine who say, oh, how do you wear this suit? This is very cheap. Or get it from Ross, for example, is another kind of store. But because their suits have to be $1,500. Now, I don't do that kind of thing. But, you know, I don't have the desire for it. So I'm happy, you know, to just have, you know, the decent clothes that I can clean. But just different people have different expectations. So I'm totally with it. But there's no solution to this issue of disparity. How do you deal with wealth and poverty, regardless of crime? Are you going to redistribute? I mean, for a lot of intellectuals, Muslim and Arab intellectuals in particular, they really take Marx to be the final prophet, not Muhammad, the prophet of Islam. For them, Marx is the last prophet. And this guy came up with the most important doctrine of our time, that wealthy people don't deserve their wealth. There's something wrong in the way. And of course, in medieval Islamic law, it's exactly the opposite, right? You You believe that something is lawful because it's lawful, even if your dad is a thief, but you don't know anything about why he stole or who he stole from. The inheritance money is lawful, right? You understand this kind of so, which might drive a lot of people to think that medieval Islamic law is a little bit of a capitalist system, but it has its socialist moments, of course. So it's a mixed system. But yeah, I would like to solve the problem of wealth. Does anybody have a way to solve the problem of wealth? It's just very hard. Some people, capitalists, of course, always tell us some people work hard and some people are lazy. I have a student, Leonard Wood. He was my student, the one who wrote Islamic Legal Revival about the law schools in Egypt and all that. He works now for Sidley Austin, which is a big law firm. He works in mergers and acquisition. So he tells me, well, it's a very simple thing, Ahmed. Some people have to work and they have to return 30 cents on the dollar, and some people don't have to work. So you will always, he attacks these socialist professors who just always talk about wealth and how wealth is very bad and all that. So it's just that they're lazy people. So there's nothing we can do about that. I know we're over time. Going over time. But there's a question from Serdar. Yeah, maybe I'll
Yeah, it's already 1:30, or it was 1:30. So yeah, the meeting is coming to an end. So sorry, Sarah, it's okay.
Okay, Serdar, let's have this conversation outside. Let's just email and I'll give you my phone number and we'll chat.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, then, yeah, I just want to say thank you to you, Professor Ahmed, for your lecture and also for participating with us in the colloquium the last weeks. It was a pleasure for us, and we wish you all the best, and maybe we can meet each other again in another setting, or it would be nice. And enjoy your time in Erlangen. I don't know if you leave next week or we can't hear you.
I leave Friday morning, so I am just getting the bag out, and I had a great time in Erlangen. Okay. Oh, that's great. Okay, then all the best for you and also to the others. And some of them we meet in the evening, I think. And have a nice week and a nice time. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks.
It was great. Yeah.
Okay, then see you.